Sometimes the burdens of everyday life weigh us down to the ground. It's good when there are people you can lean on who offer understanding and support, because if that is not the case, everything can end very tragically. Anli Lebensstegen was born on April 5, 1959 in Poland. She was born in the city of Bialystok, where she also spent her childhood. At a more conscious age, Anne moved. She wanted to broaden her horizons and start a new life here. The young woman decided to settle in the big city of Mississauga in the province of Ontario. Mississauga is the sixth largest city in Canada. It is considered multicultural, and its main attraction is a large park bordering Lake Ontario. There is a sandy beach, and overall it is very beautiful there. It was precisely here that one day she met a man named Mr. Karubin. His name is kept secret for security reasons. The couple married and Anne took her husband's surname. In 1987, their first daughter Caroline was born. A year later, Catherine followed. The woman became a housewife, took care of the household and the children, while her husband worked and provided for the family. Although the married couple gave the appearance of a happy family to the outside world, it turned out that the man had no particular interest in taking care of the children. He quickly grew bored of family life. The older the girls got, the more disagreements arose between the spouses. Finally, they decided to get a divorce. For Anne, this was a difficult time as her husband detached himself from his children. To oblige him to pay alimony, she had to go to court. The case dragged on. The young mother faced obvious difficulties, including financial and moral ones. To make ends meet, she primarily needed work. At one point, she even had 2 jobs simultaneously from morning till evening with no days off. That was, of course, extremely exhausting. Despite her diligence, the money was barely enough for 3 people, and she had no strength left to fully fulfill her duties as a mother. Caroline and Catherine spent a lot of time without their mother during this period, as she was constantly at work. They missed her greatly and hoped that the woman would overcome all these difficulties and that everything would be good again. Unfortunately, the situation only worsened. The divorce dragged on for a very long time. Affairs fell into disarray. Anne fell into a depression. It became unbearably difficult and lonely for her. All of that began to break her. The situation was worsened by the fact that she was in a foreign country and could not even see her relatives to confide in them. She wanted to find a new man, get married, secure his support, but she didn't even have time for the children, let alone a private life. Anne couldn't even find friends here, as that also required time, which she completely lacked. Instead, Anne found solace in alcohol. She began to drink a little after work to fall asleep faster and relax. A great relief and hope for her was meeting a man named Dark. They met and began seeing each other at one of Anne's workplaces. Gradually, the woman introduced her friend to her daughters. He seemed a worthy man and partner for the future, so they decided to marry. At first, everything went well, and Anne decided that she had finally found her happiness and her life would return to its familiar tracks. In the first year of their marriage, Anne gave birth to Robert. From then on, the relationship became more tense. It was precisely in marriage that Dark's bad character traits, such as aggressiveness and lack of self-control, showed. He constantly got drunk, lost his temper, took his anger out on his wife, and behaved quite unpredictably, so much so that even Caroline and Catherine had to intervene to protect their mother from beatings. The worst part was that the man targeted not only his wife but also the girls and laid hands on them. Anne continued to seek solace in alcohol and drank more and more. Soon, she became dependent on it. However, when drunk, she was not aggressive but simply fell asleep immediately. In such moments, Dark would take advantage of the situation, mock her, and according to the sisters, raped her multiple times. This went on for quite some time before the mother found out what was happening. As soon as Anne spoke about it, Dark attacked her, beat her, and threatened her. Initially, she simply didn't know what to do in this situation. Despite her children's complaints, Anne did not want to separate from her husband, as she was panicky, afraid of plunging back into the darkness of poverty, loneliness, and depression. The older daughter took matters into her own hands and tried by all means to obtain justice and stop the violence, but no one listened to her or did anything. This couldn't go on forever, especially since Dark was becoming increasingly brutal. Finally, in 2001, they succeeded in convicting the man for domestic violence. An additional charge for drunk driving was also added. This was, of course, far from the accusations of sexual abuse he had committed at home. The sisters felt it was unjust what this man had done to the girls, but all statements and demands were simply ignored by the police. Caroline and Catherine were at least glad they had managed to isolate this dangerous man and that he no longer posed a threat to them. In any case, they perceived this as the beginning of a new life. Anne was left alone again with her 3 children. The older daughters placed great hopes in their mother at that time. They believed that she would pull herself together, stop drinking, and put her life in order. However, they were all very traumatized by the difficult relationship. Anne, too, during this time the woman began to drink even more than before. This significantly worsened the situation. She could no longer control her addiction. All the money she earned from several jobs was spent on alcohol. The girls knew their mother needed help but could do nothing. At least they were teenagers by then and could take good care of themselves and their little brother. That eased their situation somewhat, but they sorely missed their mother's attention. With growing up came even more disagreements. The girls constantly argued with her, making the atmosphere in the house tense. They argued constantly. The situation worsened further when both schoolgirls tried alcohol and forbidden substances. Of course, they had no other role model in life, only incapable and dependent parents who, as they themselves said, were failures. The girls expressed themselves very negatively about their mother. As they entered a difficult puberty, the sisters began to skip school. The situation at home became increasingly tense. People around them noticed how much the girls suffered from their standard of living. They themselves looked at their peers and noticed that their friends had a nice home, nice clothes, delicious food, and were loved by their parents. Caroline and Catherine had none of that. Even dinner with their mother did not resemble a cozy get-together. The family members had grown very distant from each other. Some acquaintances supported the sisters. They gave them food and provided them with various things, but all that was not enough for the teenage girls to feel normal. At the same time, Anne's daughters were very intelligent, energetic, and active. Their teachers described their intelligence as above average. They were successful at school and understood that the only way out of poverty was to get a good education and later find a good job. In reality, however, they dreamed of being popular and wearing fashionable clothes like other girls who had no problems with their parents. But the behavior of these children also had something disturbing about it. Some teachers noticed that Catherine and Caroline had a real talent for manipulating people. They easily got what they wanted from their classmates, and if they themselves did something wrong, they usually got away with it. Later, the girls dropped out of school altogether. As they grew older, their dissatisfaction with their mother grew more and more. Soon this led to the sisters developing a veritable hatred for Anne. They openly said that she was a useless mother who only thought of herself in the bottle. The girls turned to relatives, their father and colleagues, but no one did anything to help them. The negative attitude towards their mother grew and intensified. In 2002, they could no longer bear to watch Anne ruin herself in them. A frightening plan matured in the teenage girls' minds. At this point, Caroline was 15 years old and Catherine was 14. This, however, did not stop them from devising a plan for a bloody act of revenge. The daughters wanted to help their mother, but in a very twisted way. Their main goal was to free her from her suffering. They wanted to do this to gain popularity and profit themselves. The teenagers knew that Anne had taken out a life insurance policy for $200,000. The protagonist of the story had taken this out as soon as the opportunity arose at her work in case something should happen to the woman. This way she secured herself and provided for the next generation. But the girls did not want to wait. They decided that it was time to begin an independent life. The sisters knew they would not get the money if it were proven that Anne had died by their hand. Therefore, the plan had to be carefully worked out. Thus arose a school project titled, How to Kill Your Mother. At first, even the teenagers themselves took the whole thing more as a joke. They told their classmates about it and even wanted to win over like-minded people who would help them find the best method to kill the woman. These showed interest. They constantly discussed various details of the murder so that everything would succeed for them. Caroline and Catherine began to socialize with other young people and discussed everything openly in a group they had founded specifically for this. The friends looked for possibilities. Initially, a pistol or a knife was considered. Since they wanted no bloodshed and no suffering of the victim, they came to the conclusion that the most painless and simplest method to kill their mother was drowning. For some reason, they considered this simplest method which they could carry out quickly and uncomplicatedly without leaving traces. Naturally, all of this was discussed intensively with classmates. Caroline and Catherine presented everything as a game. As long as they could win over many young people for the elaboration of a bloody murder plan who did not even understand that it was about planning a real crime and that the sisters wanted to do this to their mother. Nevertheless, everything quickly developed into a serious planning of a crime. The girls could not stop. Drowning had already been chosen as the ideal murder method. They began to discuss this with their classmates, hoping to understand what difficulties they could expect, how to divert police suspicion from themselves and avoid punishment. They also talked about other topics. They were particularly interested in how they could guaranteed get the money from the insurance policy. The sisters planned to receive $200,000 for their mother's life and discussed vividly with their classmates what they wanted to buy with this money. The schoolgirls wanted to buy a new cozy house and set up a whole plantation of forbidden plants there. With the first harvest and the sale of the illegal substances, Caroline and Catherine wanted to travel through Europe with friends. In particular, they wanted to visit Amsterdam. Ultimately, the sisters devoted a lot of attention to this plan. It seemed truly worked out to the smallest detail. On the evening of January 11, 2003, Caroline and Catherine finally decided to kill their mother, but disagreements arose with their like-minded peers because a party among teenagers was planned for the same day. Everyone feared that the celebration might be canceled because of the murder. It seemed incredible that the students still did not take the sisters' plan seriously. Anyway, they managed to postpone the deed by 1 week to January 18. On that Saturday morning, the daughters, contrary to their habit, went straight to their mother and offered her a bottle of vodka. Anne was very pleased by this attention and had no idea that her death sentence was to be carried out. The daughters poured her one glass after another and at the same time put the forbidden substance into each glass. It was a painkiller that slows the heartbeat and in combination with alcohol can have very dangerous effects. The sisters' goal, however, was not to poison their mother. They didn't even hide particularly from their mother. Anne saw that her daughters were giving her tablets but willingly took them along with strong alcohol because she believed it would help her. All of this happened literally live. Caroline and Catherine constantly wrote to their friends via Messenger about how far the process had progressed. When the vodka bottle was empty, Anne was very drunk and sleepy. The schoolgirls informed their classmates that it was time to get rid of their mother. One boy even wished them good luck and gave them a final piece of advice. They should put on rubber gloves. The girls followed his advice and actually used protective gloves. Logically, this made one of their classmates an accomplice to the crime they intended to commit, but no one seemed aware of the gravity of the situation. At this point, Anne was feeling worse and worse. The tablets combined with the alcohol began to take effect, and the effect intensified. Finally, the girls suggested she take a relaxing bath and get a massage. She agreed. The daughters helped their mother get up. She could barely stand, so it took them about half an hour to get to the bathroom, which by then was filled with water. Then the older daughter said that her mother needed a back massage and therefore should turn onto her stomach. Obviously, the woman in this state could not think clearly and immediately complied with this absurd request. At that moment, the older daughter began to drown her. Anne tried to resist but could not free herself from her older daughter and could not defend herself. She pushed with all her might against the bottom of the bathtub with her hands, but she didn't have enough strength to lift herself up and get air. The younger daughter also helped kill her mother. The sisters were of the opinion that one must deprive a person of air for 4 minutes for them to drown. Catherine stood by and counted the time, occasionally supporting her sister. When Caroline let go of her mother, she naturally showed no signs of life. The younger sister was so glad the plan had worked that she even screamed with joy. Afterward, the teenagers wrote in the group that the project had succeeded. Now it was a matter of covering their tracks and diverting suspicion from themselves. But this was also carefully planned. The daughters arranged to meet friends at the restaurant Jack Astor's, which was not far away. The other teenagers were probably already there to later confirm the minor's alibi. Caroline and Catherine calmly composed themselves, left their mother's corpse in the bathroom, and set off to meet their classmates. The first toast was to the successful murder of their mother. The schoolgirls spent several hours there and then made their way home. A few minutes after their return, a call came into the emergency call center. The weeping girls reported that they had found the corpse of their mother Anne in the bathtub. The ambulance that was called tried to revive the woman. Naturally, this was unsuccessful, as Anne had already been lying in the water for several hours. The police were also on the scene. The sisters behaved like children, were obviously traumatized by their loss, cried incessantly, and seemed inconsolable. Interestingly, they had even rehearsed this tragicomedy with a classmate who was in a theater club. Everything had been very carefully prepared and carried out. From the outside, it looked as if the drunk mother had simply fallen asleep in the bathroom and drowned. It looked like an accident, but the experience of the police officers told them that not everything had gone so smoothly. Investigators generally rarely deal with drowning cases. Usually, adults don't die this way, but rather small children who have been left unsupervised. Therefore, it seemed strange that an adult woman who was also heavily intoxicated had gotten into the bathtub at all. Why? How could she even get there? Undress and climb in without falling and hitting her head in that condition. Everything seemed illogical. Nevertheless, the sisters had planned everything well. They had even left the glass from which their mother had been drinking in the bathroom to strengthen the police's suspicion of an accident. They managed to arrange everything so that no traces of a struggle remained. Of course, no one had broken into the house either, so there were no strangers inside. No one had suspected bribery or the age of the perpetrators, of course. Who would have expected that desperate teenagers were capable of drowning a close person? In any case, the police had to speak with Caroline and Catherine to clarify all details. The two sisters told an emotional story about how they had found their mother lifeless when they returned from the restaurant where they had been with friends. They admitted that Anne had been drinking when they left the house, but that was nothing unusual, as she had been alcohol dependent for years. The woman had never been aggressive, but had rather tried to distract herself from her exhausting workdays and private problems. According to their account, the teenagers returned around 10:30 p.m., immediately discovered their mother's corpse, and called 911. The dispatcher instructed them on how to behave until the ambulance arrived. The girls pulled their mother out of the bathtub and began CPR, but it was all in vain. Now it had to be decided where Caroline and Catherine would live until they came of age. The girl's younger brother, Robert, was with his father at that time. He was only 3 years old. Thanks to his sisters, the boy was doomed to grow up without a mother. The detectives, meanwhile, worked at the scene of the alleged accident. First, the time of the woman's death had to be determined to understand if Anne had really been alone in the house. They relied on the water temperature for this. The water in the bath had long since cooled to room temperature. This indicated that Anne had died at least a few hours before her discovery. No signs of violence could be found on the woman's corpse. However, the children did not manage to commit such a perfect crime that they remained undetected. The medical examiner determined that traces of desperate attempts to rise out of the water and get air were visible on the victim's body. Anne seemed to have struggled with someone holding her down. Barely visible marks were found on her fingertips. Furthermore, the woman had tried so hard to save herself that she had torn off several fingernails. Nevertheless, after the toxicological examination, all police doubts were dispelled. A lethal dose of alcohol was found in the woman's body, so her death was immediately recognized as an accidental drowning under the influence of alcohol. The investigation was closed, and the aunt took Caroline and Catherine in and became their guardian. As planned by the girls, they received the money from their mother's life insurance, part of which benefited their younger brother, who remained with their father. It seemed as if this originally joking school project had become the perfect crime. This time, only chance could expose the criminals. Caroline and Catherine simply could not keep quiet about their success. The information about their deeds spread among more and more people. They showed not the slightest remorse. They boasted that they had not only killed Anne but had gotten the money and had even escaped justice. Now they wanted to realize their dream of buying a nice house and filling it with forbidden plants, but the ambitious schoolgirls did not manage to realize their new grand project. 11 months after the death, a friend of Caroline's went to the police to report the murderers. She had known from the beginning, but only now was her conscience tormenting her so much that she could no longer sleep. The friend revealed the truth about the planning and preparation of the crime, which had taken place online. She granted investigators access to her computer where all dialogues were recorded. The police could not only see how this plan had been hatched, but also found numerous confessions from each of the sisters. The investigators, however, were of the opinion that they needed something more substantial. Therefore, they decided to use the friend to obtain new evidence. Listening and recording devices were installed in her car. Now the perpetrators only had to be convicted by their own voices. That was actually quite simple because Caroline and Catherine could literally talk about nothing else but the murder, even almost a year later. One only had to broach the subject, and they would begin describing the course of the crime and their high qualities as murderers. Even 11 months after the cold-blooded murder, they continued to willingly talk about this event, still with obvious pride and without remorse. Because of this, there were several dozen witnesses who had heard the sisters' confessions. Up to that point, however, hardly anyone had taken the schoolgirls' stories seriously. Now their talkativeness allowed the details of the heinous plan to be reconstructed. In particular, the sisters immediately mentioned the tablets, which had not been found in the first toxicological examination. The test simply had not been conducted fully. After the lethal alcohol dose was detected in the blood, everything else was dismissed as irrelevant. Finally, everything came to light, and on January 21, 2004, at 7 a.m., the police stood at the aunt's doorstep. where Catherine and Caroline lived. Both girls were arrested and taken to the police station in their pajamas. They were still sleeping. Furthermore, the main suspects' computers were seized. During interrogations, both denied their guilt and tried with all their might to portray themselves as innocent, which completely matched the behavior pattern of manipulators. They even refused to wear the clothes offered to them by the police. Both remained in their pajamas. This was probably meant to reinforce the impression of their innocence. Naturally, no one believed them. Under the pressure of evidence, the older daughter Caroline was quickly broken. She broke into tears and confessed to having killed her mother. Interestingly, however, they failed to break her younger sister Catherine. She withstood hours of police interrogations and continued to insist on her innocence. By this time, however, investigators had recovered the sisters' browser history and correspondence, which had previously been deleted from the computers. This allowed new shocking details of the cold-blooded crime to be uncovered. The investigators reviewed all the correspondence provided by the witness. It was obvious that the sisters were dissatisfied with Anne's alcohol addiction. Even from these data carriers, enough evidence was gathered to charge the sisters with premeditated murder. When rumors about this incident and those involved spread through the media, it shocked all of Canada. It involved two 16-year-old schoolgirls who had cold-bloodedly murdered a close person. Given the age of the accused, the country's juvenile justice system was activated. Interestingly, both were even released on bail and placed under house arrest until the trial. Finally, the trial began. Interestingly, the accused were allowed to wear the pajamas they had been arrested in during the initial phase. Many considered this an obvious manipulation of the jury to soften their attitude towards them. This, however, changed little. The prosecution presented two motives for the murder: the insurance money and the desire to break out of the vicious cycle with their alcoholic mother. According to the correspondence, they even saw it as a kind of liberation for their mother from her suffering. During the hearings, dozens of other students also appeared. They were all involved in the same project. They had taken on roles in the planning and given advice. Therefore, they could well have been considered accomplices. Ultimately, however, none of them were held accountable, as it was concluded that they were not aware of the gravity of Caroline and Catherine's intentions and believed it was merely a game. Given the carefully constructed evidence, Catherine and Caroline, of course, had no chance escaping punishment. They were found guilty of first-degree murder. For minors, however, the maximum sentence under these statutes was only 10 years imprisonment, of which they only had to spend 6 behind bars, while the remaining 4 were placed under house arrest. Due to good behavior, the older sister was released after 4 years in 2009. At that time, Caroline was 22 years old. Shortly afterward, Catherine, also 22, was released. Under Canadian law for the protection of the rights and privacy of minors, their names were not published in the media. However, it was not possible to keep this information secret for long, as the sisters spoke too openly about their terrible crime. The protection didn't work. Their identities were uncovered. This, however, did not prevent the murderers from starting a new life. Both enrolled in college and received their diplomas. Catherine completed her law degree and got married. Caroline decided on a career in technology and became a scientist. Later, she became a single mother and fully recognized the difficulties her mother had struggled with back then. 17 years after the cold-blooded murder, in 2020, Caroline spoke with the media. At that time, she was 33 years old. The woman said that she had fundamentally reconsidered her deed and now regretted it every day. Today, she sees Anne as a strong woman who tried everything to keep her family afloat but fell into depression due to endless financial problems and difficult relationships with men. She was traumatized just like her children. Only they could not comprehend. scale of events back then and decided to get rid of their undesirable mother. Thanks for watching and take care of yourself.